It's the place where senior living insights and entertainment collide, like two star-crossed lovers meeting at a polka dance. This is the Bellwether Senior Living Podcast, hosted by Jeff Bell of Bell PR and Marketing. Senior living marketers, put your hands together for the host with the most. Okay, maybe not, but he tries. Jeff Bell.
My name is Jeff Bell. I am the founder and CEO of Bell PR and Marketing, and we are very excited to present this Winning at Media Readiness webinar today. My colleague Bill Pemberton is our Chief Strategy Officer. He'll be joining me to do our presentation today. And again, if you're just joining us, we're really glad you're here, and we'll make sure everybody gets a copy of the webinar after the fact, especially for anyone who joins late. Just a quick introduction of who we are for anyone who's not familiar. We are Bell PR and Marketing. We are a fully senior living focused marketing and PR agency. We're based in Kansas City, Missouri. We also have an office in Dallas. And we'd like to say that our pedigree is hard-won, specialized experience. So we were born, quite literally, I founded the company in the middle of the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I did that. I had been thinking about going out on my own and founding an agency for a while. And it seemed like the challenge of COVID-19 lent itself to a very, very special form of messaging support. And so we won a lot of client trust throughout the pandemic, and we've since grown from there. Quick rundown about me. I spent about 10 years as a broadcast journalist before I moved over into the PR marketing agency world. Have a ton of agency experience, most of it, almost all of it, completely focused on senior living. Bill comes to us with a phenomenal resume. We brought him on board after he spent time with a whole host of major corporations. He's got a ton of agency experience. He's sort of a crisis comms ninja, and has proven to be a great asset to our team. We've produced winning media relations plans for senior living communities across the country. We're very skilled in content development, digital marketing, crisis communication. We consider ourselves to be savvy brand specialists, and we specialize in those agile brand narratives that burnish your brand. We're fully integrated, top to bottom, and we can bring, while our focus today obviously is on media, we really can bring a full spectrum of marketing tools to bear should you need our support. We'll dive into the presentation now. Just a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. Media mastery will be section 1. We'll also talk about effective interviewing skills. And then we'll, in our final section, discuss crisis planning and management. We will have time at the end for Q&A, so please save your questions for the end. We'll make sure we allow plenty of time. And if we go over for some reason, Bill and I have sort of fine-tuned our calendars to make sure we can stick around, and we will answer every question that anyone has. Lastly, we will send those crisis PR workbooks over next week via email. And if you'd like us to help you customize those, we can set up meeting times at no additional cost. So we'll start with media mastery here. I will kind of talk through this, and Bill will jump in as well. We kind of like to just bounce off one another as we do these presentations, and so that's kind of the plan today as we move through this thing. So first of all, just right out of the gate, it's very important to understand the value of your brand. And a lot of people undervalue their brand. Surprisingly, we consider brand to be a priceless corporate asset. It's unrealized. And frankly, I believe it's more valuable than your hard assets. You spend years, decades more building your brand. And a good brand is essentially guaranteed credibility. And it creates a shorter sales cycle. And we all know that's so important in senior living because we have one of the longest, if not the longest, sales cycles of any industry. Quick case study. Gillette, a few years ago, you may remember this. It kind of got lost in the news after the pandemic hit, but they essentially had some really bad brand PR related to some advertisements that they put out there. that sort of it created some accusations of toxic masculinity, which is a word we've heard more and more in the media these days. What happened out of the whole thing is their sales dropped 1%, while general sales in the industry had grown about 5% at the same time. Again, this was just pre-pandemic, so the economy was still humming along. Company the size of Gillette, a 1% drop is just is huge. And so it really speaks to the importance of brand reputation and being ready for any type of a crisis that comes along. There's no one way that a brand meets its demise. I wish I could tell you it's just a nice big iceberg that you've got to be ready for as you're charting your course, but it can literally be death by 1,000 cuts, a stream of negativity over time, or it can be lost overnight. We're talking about scandals, abuse, which unfortunately we have seen a fair amount of bad publicity around in our industry. Poorly managed crisis can literally end your community, as I'm sure you know. It's really hard, almost impossible to recover fully from a brand damaging event. And an agency partner, that would be us, we consider ourselves truly to be attorneys for your brand. Sometime in the late 80s, there was this sort of idea that emerged that brands are assets within themselves. We certainly subscribe to that. We think that's absolutely true. So you never know, as I mentioned, the iceberg analogy, you just never know when one's going to pop up. You're probably familiar with the Emeritus brand if you've been in senior living very long. They were profiled on national television a number of years ago for bad management. They were hit with a number of legal judgments, horrible practices that were profiled in great detail. Frankly, it was shocking across the country. And they were eventually acquired by Brookdale. That Emeritus brand is still on some of the properties that Brookdale now owns, but the brand was really stained forever. And it's a good case study in what can happen and how it can happen very, very quickly. So what's the obligation of PR and marketing, especially PR when it comes to media readiness? Number one, incidents that are real or imagined are going to pop up, and how well you fare has a lot to do with the foundation that you hopefully have been building. And if you're not, will begin to build and foster as a result of this call. Your readiness prep, it's got to begin well before an incident ever arises. The last thing you want is that sort of chaotic response scenario, because that sends its own kind of message. So what does a full-blown crisis look like? Well, they've got a lot of things in common, but everyone's unique. Accusations is one type of crisis, and in the world of online reviews, that has taken on an entirely new meaning. Accusations of poor care, accusations of abuse, bad working conditions, theft, etc. There are accidents, which we all wish didn't happen, but they do. Injuries to residents, fires, automobile situations, falls, drownings, etc. And then acts of nature. And you might say, well, if I'm not in the hurricane zone or the earthquake zone, I'm probably good. But if you're in Tornado Alley, if you're in a flood zone, other situations like explosions can happen. And as we all learned a couple of years ago, pandemics, which is probably something that was always maybe somewhere in the back of our minds, but truly we probably didn't expect to experience what we did. Negative press is always there. What you're seeing on the screen is just a basic search of senior living scandal. And you can see what comes up across the board. Right there at the kind of mid to lower right, story about a woman passing away after wandering away in cold temperatures. It breaks our hearts. And it's almost impossible to recover from something like that. And so you don't want to show up on the Google search in this way. And we try to we work on behalf of our clients every day to make sure that there's a nice firewall in place if a situation like this should come up. So you really have a choice, and that's what this presentation is about. Is the media going to be your best friend, or are they going to someday become your worst enemy. And I always go back to years ago when I was in the agency world. We had a client that said they didn't want to do any type of claiming of their Google business pages. They weren't really interested in reputation management because they sort of thought, well, if we just ignore this, it won't impact us. And of course, the opposite is true. If you're not proactive, you're going to be reactive. And so we certainly hope that that everyone is choosing wisely. One of the things we say is get caught doing good. Develop an authentic community engagement resume. So what does that mean? It means, and I'll kind of work from bottom to top here, develop a network of local market advocates, people who speak well of you. Invite the media to your community for events. One of the mistakes people make in measuring media relations is to say, well, we sent a news release out, but no one really came. Number one, if you work with an agency like ours, we have about a 97% rate of return on getting media to come to events, getting media to cover stories that we promote. But even if they don't, what you've created is a situation where the media is familiar with you. Those reporters are hearing from you on a regular basis. They know what's going on at your community, and you're creating a reputation without even realizing it. So build that reputation for philanthropy and show off your brand as being engaged in community support. There are so many senior living organizations out there, healthcare organizations that are doing great things, and they're not promoting them the way they should. Think about Alzheimer's walks, Meals on Wheels, Angel Tree, etc. So when trouble arises, and this is the second part, be the first to set the tone or set the meme. Establish the story narrative as early as you can. Don't wait for the media to show up on your doorstep. We saw a lot of this with COVID-19, where some communities were proactive, other communities were reactive. Understand the media process, how they work. Understand who the media feeders are. Twitter, competitors, wire services, word of mouth. It builds an echo chamber kind of an effect. And so make sure you're setting the narrative as early as possible. Be proactive. Even if it's a crisis situation, it always looks better from a public perspective if you're the one who brings things to the media's attention versus the other way around. I always go back to what I call the Bill Clinton effect. We remember back in the 1990s, the scandal with Monica Lewinsky, and I compare that to a similar situation that occurred with David Letterman, who we all know from late night fame. Both of them had extramarital affairs. One of them sort of went into denial and avoid mode, and the other one, at the top of his broadcast, took it head on and said, look, this is what we did. Here's reality. And no one talks about David Letterman's extramarital affair anymore, and people are still talking about Bill Clinton. So just a thought about being proactive and also taking ownership of a situation. We want to cultivate the news media, and we do this on behalf of clients all the time. And the media is bigger, multi-splendored, more variety, more diversity than there ever has been. It's traditional, it's digital, it's social, it's independent. And so make sure you have a relationship with the media. The first time they know who you are should not be when a crisis comes along. Cultivate them with regular positive news stories, receptions at your community. Become a known quantity. Good news suppresses bad news in search engines. So when someone searches for you, they should not just find your website, they should find positive news stories about your residents, about events that you've had, about what you're doing in the community. The media is looking for direction, believe it or not. I was a reporter for years and years, and there's sort of a facade out there that the reporters have a direction and they know exactly where they're going. They don't. So be there with a reasonable overall framework and messaging, educate them, make their job easier. And when you help reporters source reliable content, you are well on your way to becoming one of their allies rather than the other way around. Influence the influencers. This is a relatively new term. If you had asked me when I was in journalism school 150 years ago, what an influencer was, I probably would have had a very different answer compared to what I have now. They're not journalists, for one thing. Podcasters, YouTubers, things like these are not journalists, and they should not be approached as such. I'm not going to send someone like Joe Rogan a news release. Think about community relations instead. And what I mean by that is maybe there's someone, maybe they have a local podcast that you're familiar with. Maybe they are a YouTube influencer and they're based locally. Think about how you can kind of work with them, maybe get some mentions on their show, and you do something with them in between, but you want to approach with caution. Kanye West has been in the news lately. You do not want him tied to your brand in any way, shape, or form right now. Smaller fish feed more people. What I mean by that is if you're going to do some sort of influencer partnership, local, smaller is much better. One hand washes the other, so bring soap, meaning if they're going to promote you, you've got to be willing to promote them. And so again, approach with caution, and it kind of goes back to why you need that attorney for your brand who can give you the best advice on what partnerships work and what partnerships you should avoid. Always, 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 we've talked a lot about your external audience. Remember your internal audience as well. Communicating to your own people is vital to your overall success. That's family members, that's employees, that's across the board. Number one, first and foremost, and it's okay to say this, to let your residents know, please don't talk to the media about us. That's easier said than done. Sometimes it happens, especially during a closure or a renovation where someone feels like they're being displaced. They get emotional and they want to go talk to the media, but make it clear that that's not in their best interest and it's not in yours. And that means keeping people from an internal communication standpoint abreast of what's going on, positive or negative. Be as clear as you can possibly be. We have all talked about, I should say, the attrition that has happened in our industry, and it was really sped up by the pandemic. The places where I have seen personally employees stay that have better retention rates are the ones that communicate better internally, because people during an unprecedented situation felt like they were informed. They felt like there was transparency. The places where the opposite has happened is where that feeling was not there. And consider a company e-newsletter if you don't already have one. It just helps to create that situation where you're viewed as someone who is transparent and communicative. Lastly, why use a PR agency? I know it feels like a plug, but we're not the only one out there either. So I guess, we're promoting others as much as we are ourselves. We live in this world day in and day out. And I always tell people, most of my clients that I deal with directly are sales and marketing directors. They are community, you could call it a community life director, an activities director. And those people are busy enough. And so we really take something off of their plate that is if you're a sales and marketing director, you didn't get into senior living because you're a PR expert. You got into it because you're a marketing expert, because you're a sales expert. So let us handle the heavy lifting on the PR end. We take the self-interest out of the discussion. So they're hearing from us rather than from the community themselves. So it just hits differently. We sound like them. We know, we speak their language. We sit on their shoulder. We give them materials that don't seem self-serving, and we know how to story mine. We know how to talk to people on the ground at your community and find those stories that exist within the community. And what I mean by that is I have visited communities over the years, and I will be visiting with someone and I will see a photograph on the wall. I will hear someone mention in passing something about a resident, and I gravitate toward it because I have my reporter hat on, and we find that story that otherwise might have been missed that paints your community in a positive light, and it makes all the difference in the world. We had a community once that had a gentleman who worked there who I just happened to meet in passing. And I found out that before he was hired there, he had been homeless. And getting that job at the community had completely turned everything around. He had started at the bottom rung, so to speak, worked his way up. He knew every resident by name. He was beloved. We put that story on the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, and the 10 o'clock news. And guess what? This community looks like the best place in the world with the best people in the world. And that's the kind of thing that an agency can bring to bear. I'm going to stop talking now and take a couple of drinks of water, and I'm going to let Bill say hello, and other than just waving, and talk through media training and tactics.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate that. Happy Friday, everybody. And Jeff's a tough act to follow, but I'm going to do my very best here. So what we really wanted to do today is really give you guys a good, solid set of insights and information to get you prepped for crisis management. Jeff's given a great overview of a lot of the preliminary kinds of things that need to happen, the importance of protecting your brand, and so on and so forth. So now we're going to get into a little bit of the meat and potatoes on how that plays out within your company. So in terms of preparing for media readiness, it needs to be something you look at as a general mobilization of the company, not just one or two people whose job it is. It needs to be something where there is at least some level of awareness across the organization, because even that person who's a receptionist out there, and they're actually very valuable to the company or to the corporation or the local community, they may be the first place the media calls. So they need to be completely aware of their role and so forth. So some of the things we look at as far as the broad spectrum of things that need to be in place, you need to have an actionable strategic PR crisis plan. Crises are like fires. Time is against you. The longer they go on without being managed, the more damage that they do. So where do you go for the fire extinguisher? And who knows how to use it? So when the media calls, who answers that phone? And you need total clarity on that point, whether it's a query to the corporate office or a query to the local community level, which is more often the case. And how are those two coordinated? So, and then we want to equip the designated spokespersons at all of those levels to be able to effectively deal with the media, not just know that they are part of the plan, but really have the training that it takes. And there is a very special set of skills that come into play, and what those are. It's not that hard, but it needs to become part of muscle memory. And that's what we'll be talking about in a few minutes. And then tracking and responding to media coverage, and we'll talk about that more later in the plan, but media or crises are not one and done propositions typically. They're going to run at least several days, maybe several weeks, sometimes months. And there needs to be tracking and adjustments and responses. And hopefully with the right care and feeding, that crisis goes away and with positive results that we'll talk about really what your goal should be. So that's kind of just the point across the board. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here for the sake of time, but there are just some things that need to be a part of your muscle memory when you're dealing with the media. And there are 12 basic things. I'm going to hit the bolds and you can get into the details in the copy that we send you. But obviously you always want to be truthful. There's always a temptation to stretch or get into areas that you don't know, which brings us to number 2. Admit if you don't know something, but make a commitment to get back, research it, and then get back with it. But don't wing it, because winging it could have you say something that is absolutely inaccurate, inappropriate, and in all probability it will be if you're winging it. And that could be used later in the crisis against the corporation, especially if legal issues come into play. Understand the media get to ask their questions. You can't control what comes out of their mouth, but then again, they can't control what comes out of your mouth. So stay focused, stay composed, because you get to talk about what you want to talk about, and you don't have to be pulled into their web or their vortex. We'll talk about how that works through bridging to the positive. Show empathy when there's ever any kind of human loss or something where someone suffered loss or hurt. The first note that should be sounded, I'm sure you've seen this on the news, is, whatever happened, who's ever fault it is, we care and our hearts go out to that family. So not failing to be empathetic. Never fail to field a media query. In other words, stonewalling has been proven to be one of the very worst strategies. If we don't respond, nothing's going to happen. That's not true. It's going to get worse until finally they're breaking the door down. Control the venue wherever possible, and that just means don't get ambushed, don't get kneecapped walking to your car. If some reporter approaches you, they're not an official government person that has any kind of authority. You're showing them a courtesy actually by giving them information. So always control that venue, and it's perfectly fine to look into the camera and say, love to talk with you. Let's set an appointment later. Never ask for questions in advance. That looks like collusion. It can seem very intuitive, but that's just not the way it works. Memorize and drill on probable questions for each scenario. Go into it with some expectation. And that's where an agency can really help you, because we know the kinds of questions that are going to come up in a situation based on experience. And so being able to anticipate those and have your message points in place is really not optional. Never admit any level of fault. That's the legal department job to work with that sort of thing, top management. As a media person or a person who's touching with the media, it's really your job to just try to make sure the narrative doesn't get out of control. Nature abhors a vacuum, so we don't want there to be a vacuum of information. We want to skillfully redirect it. Never get emotional, obviously, or lose your temper or use foul language. We see that rarely, but it does happen in the media. Somebody just loses their temper, and immediately they've lost the argument, because a lot is just based upon your personal integrity and conduct. Never disparage another person or company publicly. If you have an employee that really goes south on you and creates some real problems, don't get into name calling. Don't disparage that person. Always use the utmost of courtesy, and just being polite, and be committed to training, because a lot of things that work in media are not intuitive, and some of it's counterintuitive. So, learning how to develop the body language, the tonality, and the answers kind of comes from a place of muscle memory, and that's regular training. We really stress the need to get your official spokespeople trained for that. That's a great segue for our next slide. And Jeff, you can jump in at any point, but one of the things that's very near and dear to my heart over my career when I've been involved in crisis public relations is the art form of really controlling the interview and stepping in there, not being swept away by the media narrative, but redirecting that media narrative. So we're showing a couple of railroad tracks here to show this thing can go in one of two directions, right? It can go the reporter's direction, or you can gently shunt that conversation, to continue the metaphor, into the direction you want it to go, to the destination you want it to go to, which is your message point. So it's called reframing the story to set your narrative. And so one of the first principles is do not ignore a direct question from a media person. That's always, people think, well, if I don't answer it, I can't mess up. Well, you've already messed up if you don't address it. Acknowledge their question, but you can do it very briefly. We'll talk about how that works. So acknowledge a question, but quickly segue to redirect that conversation. Again, bridging to the positive. We'll look at it in a minute. Otherwise, the message that you're sending there is that you're evasive and defensive, because why wouldn't you answer the question? We all find it annoying when a reporter asks the government or anybody a question and they actually just start talking about something else. So we want to gently but firmly redirect the dialogue after acknowledging that. So a reporter comes in a situation trying to build a puzzle, and the way they build that puzzle is by talking to different people, getting different information. You want to help them build that puzzle as fast as possible and make it begin to take on the appearance and overall direction you want it to go. So sooner is better. And if you're helpful and really help them get that filling in the blanks, they've got a deadline to meet. They begin to see you as a source there. So next slide. So bridging to the positive is what it's called in the crisis PR world. And here's how it works. There's such a thing as a bridge, or bridging to the positive. Again, the reporter may come with something kind of negative, like, why did you guys let this Alzheimer's patient get out? Why weren't you watching them? And you could very easily get pulled into that and get on the defensive. And before you know it, if someone hits you with a string of questions, you get really kind of get backed up and backed up and backed up, and you're on the defensive. Not a good place to be. As we've talked about, you want to bridge to the positive. right after acknowledging what they've said. So then continue to bridge to the positive. You want the interviewer to hear regarding that line of question and not be taken down their line of logic. So we've talked about, not being pulled into their questions, but begin to offer facts that support your narrative. Repeat step 2 for each question. In other words, someone says, why did you let this Alzheimer's patient get out and get hit by a car? Or is that what happened? An example might be, well, the full information is not available on that yet, so I can't comment to that directly. But what I can tell you, and the facts we can tell you are, this person was under direct supervision 30 minutes before this happened, or whatever your message points are. You want to bridge to your message points from their questions, bridge with a segue, acknowledging their comment, but then taking it back to the direction you want it to go. Finally, the reporter should really have nothing to go on but the words that you're sharing. So they can't write a negative story because you've never been pulled into the negative line of questioning. And so literally you can write your own headline. If you keep repeating one way and then another what the outcome was, what the real reason is, when that reporter gets back and writes that story, it's not at all unreasonable that you would see some facsimile of what you were telling that reporter actually defining that story. That's controlling the meme. So some proven bridging responses would be, that's how or not how I see it, going back to, I can't speculate on that, but what I can confirm, you see, you start by kind of catching the fastball, and then you pivot, and then you take it the direction you want it to take, pushing it over towards your landing points or your message points. I'm not sure about that, but what I do know is the resident was always under supervision. We have the highest standards. We're always observed. There's more information coming out all the time. So that's responsible. You don't want to just bridge over into an amorphous, no, it never happened, and we're blameless. That's kind of the Baghdad Bob phenomenon, the guy that was a spokesman in Iraq, where he was talking about how Iraq was defeating America in Iraq, and you could see American tanks driving right behind him, obviously occupying Baghdad. So it was hilarious. But what we want to do is get them to bridge to actual factual data that is real and concrete that we have put forward. Okay. And just tongue in cheek here, break for a quick commercial. We can provide specialized training for your selected execs via our executive interview training module. It's a half-day course if we do it on site, or it can be 3 separate Zoom sessions, and includes media interview coaching using actual company news stories and background, a video of training interviews, review sessions, because there's a lot of, when you see yourself in an interview situation and you begin to pick up the little tics that you might have when you're nervous, or things that signal, if you learn how to control those and mask those, not have those, then you're using your whole body as a messaging tool. And you get that through video, watching it on video, and we can video that for you. And we play reporter. Development of standard Q&A scenarios for practice back at home locations. Again, you want to work with an agency on this because of just our depth of experience and what kinds of questions you should have and what are appropriate responses. Okay, now back to what we're looking at, but just want to let you know that we can help you there. So next area we're going to be looking at is the core thing. One of the core tools within this program is crisis comms planning and management. How does that work at your local community? So again, giving you a little bit of actionable kinds of concepts here. Jeff, you want to?
Yeah, I will take us home here, Bill, as they say. So it's not about I guess what I should say is not planning to win is more or less the same as preparing to fail. So there are some core principles that you need to have when it comes to effective planning and management. Crisis comms planning has got to go from top to bottom. It can't be something that is just C-suite level and you expect it to be good. Everyone in your organization needs to have some idea of how this is handled. So it's a company-wide commitment to protecting the brand. And you may be asking yourself, well, how in the world do I get someone who works part-time? They're a high school student, they work part-time in the kitchen. How do I get them to care about protecting the brand? Well, the truth of the matter is, are they going to care on a deep level as much as you do about the company? No, probably not. But you can, through good communication, through the transparency that we talked about earlier, make them aware of and have a level of commitment to that brand. It's centered around a formal crisis communications plan, which we'll talk more about what that looks like in a minute, and an ongoing commitment to keeping finely tuned media readiness in place. Your crisis planning and management, you've got to be systematic and logical when it comes to crisis resolution, and it has to be understood by everybody across the board. So the playbook, we always tell people, have a formal binder that has a plan, a crisis comms plan. It's your Bible for media readiness. It may be part of something you already have in place, which is an employee handbook or something of that sort. Make sure it's simple, but also not too simple. Something that's easy to learn, something everyone can understand and update. I always use the example of if an airport has a crisis communications plan that was written before 9/11, not going to really do anybody any good. So make sure it's updated. Have a 3-ring binder. Make sure you're clearing sections with sort of intuitive, fast reference. Keep it handy. Again, make sure it's updated regularly and support it. Have quarterly or semi-annual drills. And again, we can help with that. We all know that people are going to come and go within your organization, and you don't want to have a really nice media training in place, nice and you feel like everyone's prepared, and then people leave your organization, you never do the training again, and you've got gaps in your system. Core elements for a PR plan: make sure you have a structure in place for crisis PR. Make sure you've got a process in place for media readiness. Make sure you have resources in place to support that process. A process means nothing if the resources aren't there. Address your internal communications, have reports, updates, and other key communiques. It's all got to integrate like clockwork. And frankly, some of those reports can come from one of two places: either an investment in a group like Meltwater that monitors your media mentions, monitors how people are talking about you from reviews to news stories, etc. Or you can work through an agency which is already invested in that and is frankly probably going to lower the price for you because we do it across the board for so many clients. But the bottom line is you want to have a plan in place, but you also want to know what's being said and be constantly monitoring the media. A little bit of flying in formation information. Your structure for crisis PR. There's got to be an organizational chart and a description of responsibilities for team members. Obviously, you don't want the person who answers the phone at reception to be taking media inquiries, but you also don't want a situation where you've designated one person to take those inquiries. They're out of the office on vacation and you don't have a second in command or a third in command. And make sure there are venues that are sort of designated for meetings, whether that's corporate or at the local level. And again, kind of going back to what Bill said earlier, you don't want to be walking to your car and have a reporter stick a microphone in your place, but you also don't want to bring them into the community and say, well, let's just go over here. Think about where you would have those interviews take place, where those meetings would take place, and make sure you've got a structure in place just across the board. Make your playbook second nature. Have a procedure in place for your media team selection, a procedure for incident identification as well as escalation. Make sure there's a procedure for media outreach, ongoing media engagement, and make sure you've got a procedure in place for updating your crisis plan. We could have good intentions that, oh yes, we're always going to update this, but you know as well as I do, sometimes other things take priority. And when a crisis comes into play, there is nothing more comforting than knowing, hey, we got a set of policies and procedures in place. Everyone's been trained. They know exactly what to do. And no matter how bad this may seem, we are as prepared as we can possibly be to handle it. So your tool belt, what are the resources that you need to support these procedures? Well, have a master Q&A in place for various scenarios, or have an agency partner write it. Make sure that you've got release forms, letter templates already in place. One of the things that often comes up is a community will either be undergoing renovations and residents have to be moved, or heaven forbid, one of your communities is closing. Don't be writing things from scratch. Have those things in place, those letter templates. So you're already a step ahead of the game, and you're filling in blanks rather than starting with a blank. Internal crisis PR resources, have those templates in place. Training guides, content crisis strategy, and in some cases, special software. We talked about listening, Hootsuite or something similar. So if you've got several different social media channels, you can post stuff out across the board and not have to log into Facebook and do one. And then you log into your LinkedIn and you do another, and it takes time. Cision, another one of those pretty pricey investments that will get you the media contact information you need. Agencies typically provide it at less cost or for no cost at all. There's no time to start from scratch when you're creating the tools you need to respond quickly. Make sure you have them in place from top to bottom. Track the crisis. So make sure that not only are you handling it and you've got your foundation in place, but you're reporting on media coverage, or you're getting reports. You're getting internal updates, that you are the masters of how those internal updates go. You are in charge of your key directives and responses, and even legal comments and advisories. You've got a system in place for those. I always say we're attorneys for your brand, but we are not your attorney. And in some cases, we need to work hand in hand from an agency standpoint. COVID comes to mind, with legal, to make sure that the messaging meets all of those qualifications as well. You don't want to get a phone call from your attorney that says, hey, I saw what you said in the newspaper, and guess what? Now you've opened yourself up for a lawsuit because you didn't run that messaging through us first. The good news is, you've won when your crisis is resolved in this way. Your brand looks stronger, not weaker. Your integrity was reinforced at key points. Again, bad situations are going to come up, but did you come out of it looking like you're an organization that has integrity and has a strong leadership in place to handle anything that comes along? You can't get rid of all ill will. We all know there's always going to be those certain individuals who are never satisfied no matter what. But in general, ill will has been resolved. There's been no avoidable legal repercussions. There's stronger confidence across your organization in handling these issues. And you've got proven skills at every level. And yet you always know areas where you can grow, and you proactively work to make sure you are growing in those areas. Just a reminder, this next coming week, you will, because you attended this webinar, receive a PR crisis management workbook. This is just an idea of what the cover will look like. It's customizable for PR crisis planning. So if any of you truly would like to schedule some time for us to help you work through that, we are offering that at no additional charge or cost. So please take advantage of that. We would be more than happy to help. And with that, we will take the remaining time. We've got a little over 15 minutes here. We'll take any questions that anyone has, and Bill and I are glad to answer those.
I think Sarah had a question about HIPAA. Sarah, you want to ask that question?
Yeah, sure. So I guess as I'm thinking through many of the crises that happen in our communities, especially if they're dealing with a resident, sometimes you just can't answer the question the way to their satisfaction. You might know that the answer is really good, but if I share this, I'm going to violate HIPAA. So how do you deal with that and make sure that you give them a good answer, but you don't violate any HIPAA rules?
Yeah, so I think it starts with what Bill mentioned about having those two-part bridge answers. So you start with that very clearly, just be transparent. Due to HIPAA, there are, of course, certain things that we just can't talk about because it would violate the privacy of the resident, the employee, et cetera. However, I can tell you, and then follow it up with what information you can share. However minimal it may seem, because remember, all the details, they don't. So in your mind, what you're sharing may seem small, but in their mind, it may be enough. HIP has been around long enough that I think most journalists understand why that's a good thing and why there's a need for privacy. So the best answer I can give is share what you can and share it well.
Good, thank you.
Any other questions?
I'd be curious to ask the folks here how often they have something come up where they have to be concerned about negative news coverage, and if so, what have those things been, say, over the last couple of years? Obviously, besides COVID.
I would say in our case, we haven't had, it doesn't happen often, but it usually happens and it's a big one.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah, there's this temptation to not really deal with the media at all because you don't really have to, and then something big comes up and then you do. I would also say that it just, yeah, COVID really changed the landscape. We actually had unique conversations with the media that we might not have had otherwise. So I'm gonna maybe just share a story, but in Twin Cities, we have a specific reporter that everyone in senior living knows hates senior living companies and goes out of his way to find that story that's just negative. And so we've all been ignoring him, and then the stories just get worse and worse. So actually we ended up having a conversation, we as in like industry partners, along with our Leading Age Minnesota group. We sat down with him and his boss and we said, what's up and why is your slant this way and what can we do? And so it was a unique experience, but it was really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that, Sarah. That is, and sometimes you have to go to that point. I think we have all in our careers dealt with a reporter like that, where sometimes you just want to get to the crux of why did they appear to have this slant, or why is our industry of such high interest to them? And so sometimes it really is as easy as just a meeting of the minds, and you can take that further than just reporters. We had a situation with a client that was doing an expansion, and we knew proactively speaking that there was probably going to be some pushback because of where the expansion was taking place. It surrounded a very historic neighborhood with a lot of people who had been in their homes for 40, 50 years or more. And so rather than waiting for those people to get upset and just sending them a letter and crossing our fingers that everything would be okay, we invited them in. And rather than saying, we're going to do this come heck or high water, we invited them in and had donuts and coffee and started to have that conversation. We're discussing doing this. We want to hear from you. We understand this is your neighborhood too. We don't own the neighborhood. And had the conversation that way. And while it certainly didn't get rid of all of the negative reactions, it definitely kept what could have turned into a much uglier situation at bay. So, you know, again, it's that it's going the extra mile when necessary. What else do we have? Any other questions or comments that we can take?
Some of you are on mute, by the way, just in case you might not be aware of it. If you want to stay on mute, that's great. But sometimes I don't realize I'm on mute and I'm talking away and nobody can hear me.
Can you, I'm sorry that I keep asking questions, but can you speak to what actually makes something a crisis worthy of reaching out to the media? I know there's different reactions from different people within my own company. Like, this is a big deal, you should talk to the media, versus it's none of their business, let's just leave it alone. You know, how do you decide it's time to say something?
You know, I think that speaks to, and Bill, feel free to jump in and elaborate on this, but I think it speaks to having that chain of command in place and that media readiness planning that we've been talking about. So essentially you have someone, and it could very well be your agency, or it could be someone on the ground who, when something like that comes up, they or a committee of people make the final call because, to your point, Sarah, people are going to have different opinions about whether something's a crisis, whether it's not. And we always say, bring it if we're not sure, bring it to the experts and let them give you the best advice on how to move forward. Bill, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's good. I mean, it's basically a risk benefits assessment, right? Anytime you reach out to the media, there's a certain, if it's a controversial topic, certain amount of risk there. However, there could be a big benefit if there's a industry trend that's going on that's negative, but your company is particularly strong and insulated from that. Maybe it's a COVID issue. I mean, there's an opportunity there to get some high ground. I think it's a judgment call. And it needs to be part of a planning team discussion. But I think that Aaron made a good point in the kind of plan that they have, which is they have an escalation program that would speak to the procedures part of a crisis plan. In other words, what is our procedure to recognize and escalate crisis events, and how do we handle them? So I think in a nutshell, it's a judgment call. And the higher the stakes are, also, I think to Aaron's point, the higher the stakes are, the more it might make sense to have an agency person at the table, because we've seen a lot of different scenarios and we can connect a lot of dots and bring them to that discussion, even if it's just an advisory role. And then you guys take it and actually create the materials and do the liaison work, or whether it's just something we all work together on a team. So no set or pat answer there. It's just risk benefit assessment.
Aaron, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, less a question and more just a statement. So I work for, I think you all know Mitch Elliott. I work with Mitch at RDG Planning and Design. And we have a crisis management agency on retainer. So I'm an in-house communications person for my organization. And we had a crisis management plan put together, but having that sort of expert viewpoint help us flesh that out and develop that escalation framework was super, super beneficial. And we've never had to actually, like, the tier 1 is the highest level of crisis escalation for us. We've never gotten to that point, at least not in my tenure, but we've certainly had several tier 3s, which is kind of the lowest one that we can manage ourselves. And I cannot tell you how beneficial that crisis management plan has been to not only myself, but also just our organization in general, of having understanding of like removing the emotion of the situation and just knowing what to do from like a very objective standpoint. So I can't recommend enough that people have that in place and work with experts like yourselves to build that out.
Thanks for sharing that, Aaron. And that reminded me of a story that I had planned to share, but I forgot about. And it speaks to one of those tier 3 situations. So the situation I'm referring to was not a major deal. It was essentially, there had been a small fire at the community. The fire was put out almost immediately. No one was hurt and everything was fine. So we're not talking about a major crisis situation, but the media, of course, heard fire, senior living community. So they naturally showed up and wanted to know what was happening. This particular community did not, apparently, and I saw this on the news. They're not someone we work with, but apparently they did not have any type of a crisis plan in place, because the media ended up just grabbing the first employee of the community that they could find, who ended up being a maintenance supervisor. And he ends up immediately becoming the face of the company. And he was not dressed in a way that we would want someone to be dressed who's on the news talking to the media. And he had no training in PR or crisis management of any kind. He didn't do a bad job, all things considered, but it just goes, my immediate thought was, well, it was a small fire, so probably no harm, no foul. But what if it was a bigger situation and that was the person that ended up being in front of the media? And so it just goes to your point about how even with a smaller, what you would call a tier 3 situation, it's so important to have that support and that training in place. Bill, anything to add or any other questions that we can answer?
Since we have just a few minutes here, and if anybody needs to leave, for sure, do what you have to do. But how many of you are anticipating continued difficulties or having a hard time relating to COVID or follow on to COVID. There's been, a lot of talk about other respiratory issues and so forth. How much in your thinking are health related issues like pandemics potentially weighing on you in terms of how that could precipitate, a PR crisis at some level?
I think in general, I'm less nervous about it because I think there's been really some good education that's gone on.
Yeah.
It's not like it was before where everyone assumed if someone died in your community that it was your fault. So there's less blame to throw around than there was before. That's probably not my top concern anymore.
And that's good to know. And I've heard that, Sarah, really across the board. I think we've been at this long enough with COVID. There's a very different feel now. I mentioned that we started Bell right at the beginning of the pandemic, and there really was a sense of, we don't know how to handle this. This is completely uncharted territory, and we're not sure how to fight back against the perceptions that are out there. And so that has definitely changed. The question now becomes, what's the next thing that's on the horizon that we sort of cross our fingers and hope doesn't happen, and how do we get prepared for that?
And I would say that I think the trend that we're about to face is the staffing shortage. Everyone's facing it, but if you're in healthcare and you don't have someone to take care of people, that is not the same thing as not having a retail person available, so
Yes,
I think we're facing something there.
agree. Could not agree more. And Bill and I have had several clients that have brought that to our attention, and brought it to our attention less from the standpoint of help us hire, and more from the standpoint of, how do we change our image to where people want to work for us, and how do we use PR to do that? That's a separate conversation. It could be a separate PowerPoint. But I think that that media readiness and sending the media stories that they want to cover is part of that playbook. I had a client in Texas during the heart of the pandemic, and we found out through conversation about something totally unrelated, that they had like 5 or 6 nurses all working there who had grown up together. And so we wrote a media release, told that story to the media, and they came out. We had TV coverage, we had newspaper coverage, and it's one little tool in your belt, but it's something that anyone who heard that, who was thinking about working in healthcare, well, that's the kind of place I want to work, where it's like family, and these people have been together all this time, and look, they all work at the same place, and COVID's been tough, but they're getting through it together. So there's a power there with storytelling that I think is part of that playbook.
Maybe time for one more quick question, and I would like to just pick the collective brains here a little bit. As people in your positions, I think absolutely the staffing issue, and especially healthcare care levels and so forth, vital. Any other top 3 concerns you have that, as communicators in charge of protecting your brand, where you feel a certain kind of vulnerability?
I think one is we have, it's people, right? We have team members and residents, and they don't always do the things you want them to do, and then you're vulnerable to what they've done, and your name is just sort of associated with it. We've had a story that just sort of lingers about a team member who did something illegal, and we got sucked right into that one.
Yeah.
Do all of you have ongoing positive outreaches to the media, not just the occasional press release, but a strategic ongoing, say, monthly kind of overture to the media about positive engagement with the local community? it's going to be a little different for you, Aaron, because you're with a design firm, I believe, but just throwing the question out there.
I think it's one of those things that I want to have a strategy around. But at the end of the day, you have all these competing priorities, and this one doesn't have an immediate return on your investment.
Yeah. And that, you know, that goes to the heart of why Bill and I thought this presentation was so important, because it's, you know, there are certain foundational elements that we do, whether it's in business or in family life, you know, that they don't have that immediate return on investment, but they have a long-term return. I think about things that I spend money on for my house that, boy, I would sure rather take a vacation, an extra vacation or just one vacation, but we prioritize that instead. And no, it's not fun, and maybe it'll never be an issue, but we do it anyway. And so I think that really speaks to the point of why we thought it was so important to share this.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. An hour went by very quickly. Did you find it valuable? Were there things here that helped round out your overall sense of direction on crisis PR?
Yeah, I thought it was very, very helpful. Thank you. I'm really excited about the workbook.
Coming out next week, and we're rolling in that complimentary tutoring. So, you know, we'll take some time to walk with it through you via Zoom and so forth, so you get the absolute most out of it. I don't want to impinge on anybody else's time here, but I've enjoyed every minute of it. It seems like it's been 10 minutes, but here we're already done. Unless anybody has any closing comments, Jeff, anybody? We'll go ahead and call it a day.
Just thank you. It was very good. Thanks.
Thank you, Gene.
Yeah, just a big thank you to everyone who took time to attend. We know it's the holiday season. Some people are out. Feel free to share this presentation with others, and we will also get it up on our YouTube channel, which also has our podcast, by the way. If you are just interested in hearing from your peers in senior living about various topics, check out the Bellwether Senior Living Podcast. It's on everything from Apple Podcasts to Spotify and everywhere in between, as well as our YouTube channel. Check that out as well. And just thanks. We really appreciate it. And I wish everybody the happiest of holidays.
So
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend. Happy holidays.